All right, friends. Well, welcome. Here we are. Our first pivot of the semester. Uh, Thankfully, maybe that pivot was more about me than it was for you students. But here we are, anyways. That's the nature of what this semester could end up looking like. And so we're going to make some lemon out of lemonade. All right. It wasn't my intention that by week 2 I was going to be out of the classroom for potentially 2 weeks. We will see. My wife got her test today, so we're waiting on the results, which will take a couple days. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to make the best of this, and we're going to give you the content that is going to be necessary for us to move forward throughout this course. So here's what I'm going to do. Today I'm going to put together 3 to 4 lectures. Each lecture is about 7 to 10 minutes long. You'll watch these lectures. And then I'm also going to post, probably tomorrow, maybe later on today, the Jephthah sermon that I'm going to do, along with the breakdown of what that looks like as all 3 of these worlds, we begin to work all 3 of the worlds of the text out. And then you're going to have a discussion post that you will respond to the lectures and respond to the sermon, so that will serve as basic your attendance and your participation for the day. But it'll be a must. You'll have to get it done because it will be the demonstration that you've done the work for the course. Okay? So I'm going to give you the best content I can over the course of these next few lectures to ensure that we are moving forward in the way that we need to move forward. Okay? All right. So let's jump in here a little bit. When we left off on Monday, I introduced you to terminology. I introduced you to this term, hermeneutics, right? And we talked about hermeneutics is the art of making sense. It's the means by which we interpret interactions and engagements with others and with text. How do we know that what we read means what we think it means? That's the art of interpretation. And I truly believe that there is artistry involved. Now, that is not to mean that there wasn't some scientific methodology. And we're going to talk a lot about exegesis, which is the scientific process of moving through a text to ensure that we answer and ask the right questions regarding the world behind the text, the world of the text, and in the world in front of the text, so that we can come with a faithful and adequate representation of the text as we talk about it and as we interpret it, okay? But hermeneutics itself is an art form. Now, I will say there was a time, and for many of us, there is this assumption that hermeneutics should be easy, right? You read it, and it is what it says it is. It means what it says. And yet, how is it possible that 2 people, 3 people, 4 people can read the same text, read the same instance, read the same moment, and come with different conclusions, different assumptions about what it means? How is it the same kinds of texts can give birth to Lutherans and the Reformed tradition and Wesleyan and Arminianism? How is that possible? How do we arrive at that place? Now, there was a period of time, and we'll get more into this later down the road when we go into the history of hermeneutics, but there was a time in which there was the belief through about the 18th and 19th and early 20th century that we could arrive at that standard one universal rational interpretation if we applied the right methodology. The problem we became to discover is that that endeavor was already rooted in some assumptions about who got to control what that interpretation was all about. But the assumption is that we could arrive at this hermeneutics, and the first blank here at the bottom of the page of your notes is the hermeneutics of immediacy. That it's just apparent. It's there. It's in front of me. I read it, and it means what it says it means. But I don't know that the interpretation is always that plain and obvious. I think there's some work that is required. Plus, I think we have to be aware of the ways in which our subjectivity, who we are, our being, our perspectives, our filters influence and impact the reading of text. Now, again, that one frame of reference that we were talking about that I suggested from the 18th, 19th, 20th century, wanted a suggestion that you could be an objective observer. You could extract yourself from the situation. You could rid yourself of your biases and your perspectives and the limitations of your upbringing and your experience with the text, and you could take this sort of objective standpoint where you could look at the text unhindered by any of that complicating factors and tell us what it really says. If I know the original language, if I know the original culture, if I know what the author intended, and there was a lot of different elements that we tried to establish objectivity. For instance, there was one group of people that said, we need to understand the psychology behind the author so that if we can understand who the author was, we can understand what the author meant. One of the challenges we face in that is that oftentimes we interpret authors through our own cultural constructs. So if I'm going to go into the letters of Paul looking to find Paul and suggest that once I reconstruct Paul, then I can understand what Paul means, I'm assuming that I'm interpreting Paul the way Paul is, outside of just his letters, and that I'm not turning Paul into a me, interpreting Paul through my already established lenses. So maybe it's not as easy as simply reconstructing who the author was so that we can know what the author meant. But that was the assumption, that was the belief, that we could stand at this sort of God's eye view and look down upon the text and determine and discover and discern what that text means. And there was an entire methodology built up around that. Historical criticism, higher historical biblical criticism that existed in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century was an attempt to just do that. So you had lots of people that were writing lots of commentary saying this is the right, true interpretation of this passage based upon what we know of the history, the context, the culture, the people, and the author. And yet we're still arriving at these different assumptions. And there were some shifts that began to call into question the position of those who suggested that they were the ones who could interpret it rightly. So we need to be aware of that as we move forward through this. So if it's not as simple as just looking at the text and saying it is what, then how do we begin to understand? What makes it so difficult for us to arrive at the interpretation of the text? Now you've already navigated this a little bit with the Jephthah passage. Reading that Jephthah passage, we were already struck with the fact that, man, we don't understand the culture. There may be things happening here that I don't see. Plus, my assumptions may already be influencing the text. So let's take this next lecture and let's talk about what makes understanding the text so difficult. What makes being objective so difficult? Why is the subjectivity, the very nature of who we are, influential in how we read the scriptures? So let's talk about this in the next lecture.